So there's questions that I think a lot of Commander players want to know. Things like how many games on average will end with combat damage? Or how big of a disadvantage am I at if I am going last in turn order? I came across this report from playgroup.gg, which is a website that players are tracking their Commander games on. And then they're collecting that data from all those playgroups and putting it together into a report. So let's take a look at the data. Let's see what we can learn about Commander from it, and also what we can learn about designing multiplayer games of our own.
Distraction makers.
There's a few caveats here, right? All this data is self-reported. It's a relatively large sample size. It's about 30,000 games. The other thing to keep in mind here is that these are players who are interested in tracking their games. It does have a bend towards casual Commander, so keep that in mind as well. So this is not CEDH tournament data. So in the report about how games are won, combat damage won about 54.7% of games. Non-combat damage, which would be burn, draining life, things like that, won about 21% of games. This is where something like Aristocrats would sit. Commander damage won 8.7% of games. Combos only won 6.2% of games. This obviously would be indicative of a more casual player base where CEDH games are almost always won through combo. Alternative win conditions, I assume these are things like Rise of the Second Sun, 6.2% as well. Mill won more games than Poison, which is interesting, at 1.9%, and then Poison at 1.3%. So it is pretty interesting to see that most games are won through combat damage, especially if we combine commander damage and combat damage together, considering that they are both technically combat damage when it comes to sort of the game systems. It's something like 63.4% of games are won through attacking with creatures. This, I think, might give a little bit of more insight into why I think fogs are so good in the format. We'll come back around to that a little bit because I think there's another piece to that puzzle, but if you were concerned about a fog being relevant, if you were playing with just sort of any given game of Commander at like a local game store, you could rest assured that a fog will probably be relevant. The typical game length was about 52 minutes, so we could call it a little less than an hour. This seems actually a little fast compared to my sort of anecdotal evidence, where I'm wondering if this is how much this is sort of influenced by short games and long games, and this is somewhere in the middle. One of the most interesting stats, especially because this is coming from more casual-minded Commander games, is that the seat disparity in win percentage is relevant here as well as it is relevant in something like CEDH. I had seen some data that had suggested that seat order discrepancy sort of leveled off after a certain number of turns. But as we see here, if the typical game length is close to an hour, you're probably in that sort of expected turn category, right? Somewhere in that 8 to 9 range, I would imagine. Depends on how fast the playgroup plays, I suppose. But as we can see, the seat order discrepancy is still very relevant here in that there is a 7-point gap between first and last place. The trend of first place having an easier time winning the game is consistent throughout seat order. So first seat had around a 28.9 win percentage, seat 2 had a 26.2, seat 3 had a 23.4, seat 4 had a 21.5, which gives us about a 7-point gap between first and last seat. This is kind of the main thing that I want to talk about today, is the question of whether or not something should be done about the fact that fourth seat is having such a hard time. Commander is a casual format, so if everybody is sort of approaching it with that mindset, maybe this isn't all that big of a deal, considering that whoever is going to be going first is being distributed randomly amongst your playgroup. But I do think that going last, especially in a free-for-all multiplayer format, it comes with this sort of baggage, right? Where over time, as that gap widens based on who they think can win the game, they start to enter in sort of this kingmaker position. This is sort of the primary dynamic in free-for-all multiplayer games, where somebody sees that they are unable to win the game, but they still have the ability to decide who can win the game. And this is sort of like choosing who you're targeting with interaction, or countering certain spells that would basically pave the way for one of the other players still left in the game to be able to win. The problem here is that if a game is meaningful decisions with uncertain outcomes and measurable results, once you end up in a position where you are certain that you can't win the game stops being compelling. And this is where players start to look for other ways that they can impact the game, usually in the form of kingmaking. This is where I think the deeper level of politics might come in, where games that are played in succession with the same playgroup, you can sort of build up a well, you did this to me in that game, I'm going to do this to you in that game, and you build up kind of political dynamics between players. So the easiest thing I think that could be done to kind of solve this issue is to make it so that the player who goes first just doesn't draw a card on turn one. I think that would probably bring them more in line with the other players. It could be that first and second shouldn't be able to draw a card, and maybe third and fourth should, or you would go all the way down to only fourth player drawing a card on their first turn. There's also some other ways that this could be handled, especially if we're looking at major system changes for games that we are designing that happen to be free-for-all multiplayer. The biggest hurdle, I think, in Magic's systems specifically is that somewhat by design, Magic has pretty soft positional heuristics. A positional heuristic is a way for a player to tell whether or not they are in the position to win the game. And then downstream of positional heuristics are directional heuristics, which are things that give you sort of a specific from the position that you're in, now you have a specific sort of rule of thumb to operate under. So something like who's the beatdown is a positional heuristic, which is a way for players to sort of understand, again, where they're at in terms of are they winning the game or are they in the losing position. And then something like Bolt the Bird is a directional heuristic, which says, am I in a winning position or a losing position first? And then based on that, how do I determine where I want to aim my lightning bolt? Do I want to aim my lightning bolt at a Birds of Paradise, or do I want to aim my lightning bolt at my opponent's face to try to get them dead as quickly as possible? This is a bit of a challenge for Magic when you're looking to create system changes or cards that measure some way to know if somebody is in a winning position. So it becomes kind of difficult to build particular catch-up mechanic type cards because it's difficult for you to create a framework on a card that says if this player is in a position other than first place, this card should be more powerful, right? But how do you measure whether or not what position someone is in? You could do it based on life total, but that really is not a particularly good measure of who is winning the game. Life total ends up often being just sort of a resource that you can spend. And so if you sort of created a catch-up card for somebody who theoretically is not in first place and you did it based on life total, what that means is that somebody who has already gotten an immense advantage from spending their life as a resource to, say, draw cards with something like Necropotence, that puts them in a position where they then would also get the benefit of these catch-up cards if it was based on their life total. Suddenly those get sort of turned on and they're more powerful now, even though they are actually in the best position. So if we're going to look at a game that I think does catch-up mechanics particularly well, and I think has some amount of correlation between a free-for-all multiplayer game like Commander Magic, we could look at Mario Kart. And this sort of comes back to that thing I was talking about with fogs and why I think they are particularly good in Commander Magic, is because I tend to see multiplayer Commander Magic a bit like Mario Kart, where each player is sort of racing to get to the finish line, right? The difference here is that the finish line in Mario Kart, when somebody crosses it, they just get first place, and then there's a second, third, fourth, and players still get to finish out the race. Where in Magic, if one player crosses the finish line, they've won the game. The sort of solution to I am behind that a lot of players tend to look at is something like a board wipe that equally affects all players and brings players sort of back down to an even, theoretically even playing field. But as we've sort of talked about before, there's asymmetry in those board wipes still, right? Where if they don't affect certain types of permanents, players who have still gotten an advantage and have more cards in hand can recover from those board wipes quicker. They might have more lands in play than you, so they also would be able to recover quicker. And also board wipes tend to just bog down the game, right? You sort of have this weird reset where the game doesn't quite start over again, but it kind of does. You had invested those resources into that board wipe. And so instead of spending resources to get yourself further ahead, you instead have now spent your resources to bring everybody else down. If I am focused mostly on acceleration and trying to get myself across that finish line, I want to spend as little mana as possible, as few resources as possible, slowing my opponents down, right? I want to speed past them and get across the finish line. But there are instances where I might be behind, and a fog gives me a slight break in that acceleration from another player that might buy me the time to sort of pull ahead and cross the finish line before they could. That's really sort of the theory behind why I think fogs are pretty great in casual games of Commander, where most of the games, as we see from the data, are won through some kind of combat damage, whether that's regular combat damage or commander damage. Okay, so let's look at, like, I guess some solutions, right? And we've talked a bit already about the fact that you could, in Commander Magic, you could just make it so fourth player gets to draw a card and the other players don't. And that might be enough to bring things back kind of in parity. We have also seen a sort of a swath of what I would consider catch-up cards being printed over the last few years. There's kind of two different types of these catch-up cards in Magic. There's one that is sort of a parity catch-up card where it is giving you advantage based on advantage that your opponents are getting. One of the newest ones from the Marvel set is King T'Challa. King T'Challa costs 1 generic, 1 white, and 1 blue. It's a legendary creature, has flash. Whenever a player draws their second card each turn, you draw a card. It also has a transform function, but this is really the side of the card that we're interested in, and it's a 3/2. There's been quite a few of these effects, right, that are whenever a player draws their second card, implying that they are drawing more cards beyond the one that they draw for the turn, you then also get to draw a card. But this will pull you ahead because it functions off of all of the other players at the table, right? So if multiple players are drawing additional cards, you are drawing them as well when the other cards are sort of split up amongst the players. But I do think this particular ability is one type of catch-up mechanic card. You are only getting the value from this if one of your opponents is also pulling further ahead. We also see this in things like Fairy Mastermind. There's other cards that reward you with things other than drawing cards, like Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff, Tataru Taru, and honestly, Rhystic Study kind of fits into this category. Rhystic Study is a little different because the trigger that it's using is just your opponent's playing spells, which is, I think, considerably more powerful than just drawing cards. In the other versions, it's like you're trading, you're drawing a card, so I'm drawing a card, where with Rhystic Study is you are playing a card to sort of advance your game plan. If you don't pay extra mana, I will then draw a card. Where that has a compounding effect of, well, you're just trying to catch back up into the game by playing things. I am pulling further and further ahead, which puts you further and further behind. Rhystic Study is kind of a problem, let's be real. The other version of this are things that are barometer mechanics. And barometer mechanics are mechanics that measure something and then give you an effect based on that measure. I believe the first one that was introduced was Threshold, where if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, the Threshold cards are powered up. Something like Werebear gets more powerful, or Nimble Mongoose are kind of the more famous ones from 60-card formats. A couple other cards that fall in this category. One is Mindbreak Trap, where if other players have played enough spells, you can play Mindbreak Trap to exile all of them, and that's kind of a barometer in terms of how many spells have been played, right? That's a different measure. And the final one here that I would highlight is Dockside Extortionist, where it gives you treasures based on how many artifacts and enchantments your opponents have, and they would have had to play those to the board before you played Dockside in order for you to get that reward. I do think that Dockside itself is probably a little too juiced in terms of it doesn't cost enough mana for this effect, potentially. Maybe it should have been limited in the number of treasures it gives you, but I do think that Dockside Extortionist has a lot of interesting territory to explore within card design for this kind of barometer catch-up mechanic. So let's move outside of Magic for a minute. I want to talk a little bit about Mario Kart, because I think Mario Kart does an excellent job in this sort of catch-up mechanic territory. I think there's a lot of parallels here to Commander Magic. There are players who play Mario Kart pretty casually, and there are players who play Mario Kart fairly competitively. I think there's a lot to learn from Mario Kart in terms of designing kind of a free-for-all experience. One is that it's a race, right? And races are one of the easiest ways to sort of to handle a lot of the king-making issues, or the ability for players to have a lot of direct interaction with each other at all times. By the necessity of the system, as first player pulls further away closer to winning, they are less likely to be able to interact with people who are further behind. And that's just sort of a natural consequence of races. Now, when we look at other races outside of Mario Kart, some of them have more or less interaction, where if participants are split up into different lanes, something like swimming, where swimmers don't have any interaction with each other, they're just racing next to each other. Same thing with like sprinting. Mario Kart does have direct interaction still, and there's no lanes once the race is going. And so they have created a handful of tools and sort of an interesting system to kind of rubber band players back into the game who are falling behind. And then for the players who are further ahead, there are these more intricate, skill-expressive techniques and maneuvers they would need to do to keep themselves in those sort of top positions. A few of those things are slipstreaming, where if you follow close behind somebody, you can get a speed boost. There's drifting, which means that you can take corners at higher speeds, but if you drift too long, you'll spin out. There are jump boosts to go off of a ramp. You press the jump button, and this gives you an extra boost. But also, if you're in these leading positions, power-ups have sort of a self-correcting system. The better in position that you are, the weaker the power-ups that you'll get. The further behind you are, the more powerful your power-ups get. And there's a couple to highlight here. One is the blue shell, obviously, that everybody knows about. The other one that's in more recent Mario Kart games is the bullet bill, right? Where if you're in a low position, you can utilize it and it will speed boost you through the course, also navigating turns and things for you to try to get you back into contention, basically, for the race. And I think what's most important here for Mario Kart is that the system only works because they have very clear positional heuristics. You know whether you're in first, second, third, fourth, etc. And so the system can work based on that scaffolding and know that it's not giving powerful power-ups to the wrong players because the positional heuristics are kind of fuzzy. I think that fuzzy positional heuristics are probably one of Magic's benefits when you're talking about competitive play, but I do think it is a bit of a liability in free-for-all multiplayer casual play, where it's difficult for you to know who's in the lead. Oftentimes, players will choose who to attack based on their life totals, even though you can utilize your life total as a resource to gain advantage. So yeah, I think at the end of this, looking at the data, it is really interesting. It's interesting to see that fogs, I think, are as relevant as ever. Lots of games are still ending with combat damage. It's also interesting to see that the seat discrepancy win percentage problem is relevant all the way down to casual levels of Commander. With the bracket system changes and them saying that there's an expected turn to win the game on, I think that is a bit tough, right? It's strange to set a marker to say that that is now what is acceptable. And once you do that, you have players who will say, well, I'm following the rules, right, as written, even though I'm doing something that feels unfair. And so instead, it would be interesting to see Wizards explore more of these sort of catch-up style cards. I do think that the biggest change to be made here to try to solve some of the seat discrepancy is literally to just make it so fourth seat is the only one that draws a card on the first turn of the game. That probably would start to alleviate some of this problem. Beyond that, it would be interesting to have this ability for to keep players in the game, right? It's tricky, though, because if players are making these decisions to put these sort of catch-up cards in their decks, they do still need to be relevant for every position. Because it's a 4-player free-for-all game, you're likely to not be in the first position 75% of the time, right? So you would probably still want to lean towards these catch-up cards, but they shouldn't necessarily be dead draws if you draw them from the sort of first position. And it's also difficult because any type of barometer or measure that you're using in Magic is able to be manipulated. It's not a hard positional heuristic like something like Mario Kart with first, second, third, and fourth place. I don't know. I found this data particularly interesting, and I'm hoping that we see some new innovative design from Magic that gives us some interesting catch-up mechanics. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. If you are a game designer or interested in helping others test their games, you can join our Discord. The link is in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.